violent and lazy. To this end, researchers at the Australian University, ANU, analysed the implicit or unconscious bias of more than 11,000 Australian participants over a 10-year period and found that 75% of them held a negative implicit bias against Indigenous Australians. According to the ANU researchers, this implicit negative bias against Indigenous Australians is more than likely the cause of the racism they experience. While prejudice refers to negative attitudes and ideas held about an individual or group of people based solely on the membership of a group, discrimination refers to negative actions or behaviour towards an individual or group of people. We can place racism within individual and institutional contexts. An example of an individual racism might be a child making racist, offensive comments to another child in the school playground. Whilst institutional racism being seen where schools, via teachers' actions, are disproportionately excluding large numbers of black pupils. Additionally, structural racism allows us to see how the combined interaction of multiple institutions via the ideologies, cultural practices, and discriminatory processes results in racial inequalities across health, education, housing, criminal justice, and employment. In light of controversy surrounding the concept of race, ethnicity has become a more acceptable way of describing difference. Importantly, it understands human difference as being socially constructed through culture and tradition, while different physical characteristics, including skin colour, may distinguish ethnic groups. The sociologist Anthony Giddens says that the most unusual ones are language, history, or ancestry, real or imagined, religion, and styles of dress or adornment. Ethnicity might also encompass such things as diet, religious beliefs, traditions, rituals, and ceremonies, providing a sense of belonging and history across generations. The significance of ethnicity may vary from different people, however, and become more or less salient at different times. The sociologist and cultural theorist Stuart Hall refers to the new ethnicities to explain that people do not possess a singular or fixed identity rooted in either a cultural or biological essence. The self can identify with multiple groupings depending on the occasion. For example, an individual rationalized as black can occupy a range of further identities that incorporate class, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. Today, black feminist critical scholars, drawing on the work of US critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, talk about the intersectionality. See the introductory chapter, Understanding Children and Young People's Lives. This important analytical framework highlights that because individual and group identities intersect, a person or group can experience multiple oppressions and disadvantages. For example, a working class black woman may be subject to discriminations based on the overlapping identities of her race, gender, and social class. Like race, ethnicity can be the focus of negative attitudes, prejudice, and discrimination. And the International Convention on the Elimination of all form of racial discrimination, United Nations 1965, recognizes the racism exists on the basis of both race and ethnicity. Moreover, Scientologists have charted the rise of a new racism in Britain, since speaking about racial difference has become less acceptable. This focus on cultural differences as a threat to the British way of life, whatever we might understand that to be. A key concern for many psychologists and sociologists has been the formation of negative racial attitudes among children and the effect on their interactions with peers, a topic discussed in the following section. Key points. Race refers to the claim that biological genetic distinctions can be made between groups of people who differ in physical appearances. As humans share 99.9% of DNA, there is no scientific evidence to support the idea of biology distinct races, and to this end, scientific racism has been widely discredited. Many individuals, groups, and organizations still hold on to false beliefs that inherent moral and psychological characteristics are linked to physical appearance, such as skin color. These beliefs can result in prejudicial and discriminatory actions of racism that manifest in an individual, institutional, and/or structural context. Ethnicity has come to be a more acceptable way of describing human difference. It includes both physical and cultural distinctions between individuals. Like race, ethnicity can be the source of individual and group prejudice and discrimination. People do not possess a singular or fixed identity rooted in biology or any given culture. Rather, the self can identify with various groupings. This is what Stuart Hall refers to in the concept of new ethnicities. Intersectionality draws on the work of Black feminist scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw to explain how people can experience multiple oppressions and disadvantages that directly relate to their multiple intersecting identities. Racism, ethnicity, and childhood. Given that childhood has been portrayed as a state of innocence, adults have often assumed that children are colorblind and do not distinguish between people on the basis of race or develop racist attitudes until later in life. There is now, however, quite an established body of research to suggest that young children are far more naive and show an awareness of issues relating to race and ethnicity, even from a very young age. This research evidence comes from psychological, sociological, and criminological accounts of childhood and youth life stages. Psychological studies. Within psychology, there has been a long history of research into the development of children's racial attitudes. The consistent message from these studies is that young children have the capacity to recognize physical difference in such things as skin, color, from about the age of 2 years, and can begin to ascribe attitudes to people. With these differences from about the age of 3 years, psychologists have shown that as children start to learn about the world, even from early childhood, they learn about race and ethnicity and racial bias from their parents, communities, books, televisions, peers, social media, and wider culture. They become keenly aware that race, as opposed to shoe size or height, is a category of some significance in our society, and begin to attach social meaning to race as they absorb and consciousness and unconscious racial prejudice that are prevalent in our society. Psychological studies of racial bias have often involved presenting children with racial stimuli, like images of dolls with different racial characteristics, and then asking questions about their preferences and evaluations of each image doll. They might, for example, be asked which is good slash bad, clean slash dirty, good looking slash ugly, as well as which they look more like. Early work in this field was carried out in the USA by psychologists Kenneth Clark and Mamie Phipps Clark in the 1940s, both of whom were African American researchers. Their studies involved presenting black children with two dolls that were identical in everything but skin and hair color. One doll was pale and yellow hair, the other was brown and black hair. Clarks then asked their sample of children who were aged between 3 and 7 years and from different schools a series of questions about the dolls. The children were asked which doll they would rather play with, which one was a nice doll, which one looked bad, which one had the nicer color, and so on. The majority of black children selected the white doll as the one that would rather play and the one that was nice. The Clarks argued that their experiment provided clear evidence of pro-white bias, as it is known. In their sample of children, of particular significance for these researchers, though, was the observation that when black children were asked to choose the doll that looked more like them, 1/3 of them picked the white doll. From this, the findings of the pioneering study, there was evidence of black children potentially suffered from low esteem because they were aware of and internalized negative views of their race. Psychologists have repeated this kind of study many times with children of different ethnicities in both the UK and USA. While this outgroup preference, as it is known as psychologists, among black children appears to have diminished somewhat over time, the consistent finding is that pro-white bias in both white and black children remains pronounced. Both black and white display a preference for white as opposed to black skin color. And when asked to describe the difference in skin color of dolls, they often assign more positive characteristics to white than black-skinned ones. Interestingly, while psychologists have noted that this pro-white and anti-black racial bias is evident even among young children, this tends to decline in middle childhood, particularly around the age of 7. It is thought that the immature cognitive structure of preschoolers make them likely to develop racial bias, as they are only able to identify physical difference before later acquiring cultural association. As children develop the capacity for more sophisticated reasoning about the world, they evaluate people in a more balanced way, and it is suggested that their racial attitudes may lessen as they become older. Studies that use racial stimulation to examine children's racial bias, however, have criticized one of the key concerns, is that these methods require children to make definitive choices which they perhaps may not ordinarily make, and there is little room to explore variations in attitude or the biases upon which decisions are made. Choosing one stimulus over another, for example, may not symbolize outright rejection of the other. Moreover, as these experiments are conducted in an artificial environment, they give us little understanding of how this bias plays out in children's everyday lives. If a child demonstrates white bias in an experiment, for example, does that necessarily mean that she will discriminate in practice? Sociological and criminological studies. Moving beyond psychological accounts of racial attitudes in childhood, sociological and criminological studies have examined how children and young people racial attitudes can manifest into harmful behaviors and actions. In contrast to most psychological studies, however, this research provides a close-up examination of children and young people, cultural and social worlds by utilizing ethnographic research methods, including observation in-depth interviews and case studies, drawing directly on children and young people's experiences. These studies have sought to provide a deeper and more holistic understanding of the place, the impact, and racism in their everyday lives. All these studies were carried out in the 1990s, and it is unfortunate due to the continuing scarcity of research on children and young people's experience of race and racism in the UK that I'm not able to include more recent studies alongside these older texts. There's research evidence which highlights that in addition to racist name calling, some children and young people also engage in acts of racist violence, racist hate crime. An investigation by National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children found that race hate crimes against children in the UK had reached a 3-year high in the period 2017 to 2018. There were 10,571 recorded offences compared to 8,683 in 2015 and 2016. Of course, the issue of racist violence amongst children and young people is part of a much wider and long-standing societal problem. Indeed, none of the various racial and ethnic groups that have settled in Britain during the last 200 years have managed to escape widespread animosity. They have been the victims of verbal abuse, physical attacks, mob violence, and murder. The racist murder of the teenager Stephen Lawrence at a bus stop in 1993, alongside the failed police investigation and the family's dogged fight for justice, would become one of the key watershed moments in modern British history. Of course, there have been many other young victims of racist violence whose names and personal stories have never managed to capture the British public attention. This section on race, ethnicity, and childhood has focused primarily on the development of racial bias among children. But it is important to note that ideas of race and ethnicity can and do have a positive impact on children and young people's lives. Ideas of race and ethnicity can provide a positive sense of belonging and pride for children, as they learn to think of themselves as belonging to a particular group with a specific history and or custom. Moreover, despite evidence of racism in children, peer relationships, some children and young people do create very positive, long-lasting inter-ethnic friendships. In my ethnographic study, Growing Up Bad, I examined the role and significance of road culture on black and white young people post-16 transitions in an East London neighbourhood. Road culture in black influenced youth subculture, which informed the young people's dress style, speech patterns, leisure, interests, activities, and musical preferences that is largely played out in public settings, on roads, streets. However, it would be incorrect to define or portray road culture in exclusively racial/ethnic terms, as the Black reading fails to recognize the participation of large numbers of white and other minority ethnic urban youth. Road culture was central to the lives of all young people growing up in the local neighborhood and cuts across ethnicity and gender. All of the young people would inadvertently spend large amounts of time hanging about together within their local neighborhood. As such, road culture, alongside the strong attached to their ends, local neighborhood, resulted in the creation of genuine interracial friendship groups. Key points. Although children are often thought to be colorblind, there is a strong body of evidence to suggest that children as young as 3 begin to absorb the conscious and unconscious racial prejudices that are prevalent in our society. Psychological studies have focused on exploring children's responses to racial stimuli, but these experiments tell us little about the place of racism in children's everyday lives. In-depth sociological and criminological studies focus more on the children and young people cultural worlds and reveal how racism is mobilized in their everyday encounters. Whilst children and young people can absorb negative attitudes about race and ethnicity, it is important to recognize that ideas about race and ethnicity can provide a positive sense of belonging and pride for children and young people. Despite the evidence of racism in children, the young people's peer relationships, some children and young people do create very positive, long-lasting inter-ethnic friendships. Racism, schooling, and criminal injustice. To examine whether Black boys are given the same protection of childhood in their white peers, Phil Goff undertook 4 experimental studies utilizing laboratory and fieldwork. This group of social psychologists found evidence that Black boys are seen as older and less innocent, and that they prompt a less essential conception of childhood than they do their same age white peers. These 4 studies built on previous research, which also show that the strong historical link between Black people and animals, and apes specifically, may still influence this distinctive way in which individual dehumanization Black people. In the USA, Black children are found to be 18 times more likely than white children to receive a prison sentence, and due to the near universal protection ordinarily reserved for children in the West, Goff maintain that it is the process of dehumanization which explains why Black children are particularly susceptible to being treated as adults. Similarly, in a survey study, Rebecca Epstein, Jamila Blake, and Thayela Gonzalez provide evidence demonstrating that adults are often more likely to view Black girls between the age of 5 and 14 as more adult-like and less innocent than white peers, viewed within the broader context of disparities and negative outcomes in US public education and juvenile justice system. The study's findings suggest that the perception of Black girls